Notice that we have a title for our message today that could easily be mistaken as a weather forecast. Dark days. Dark days indeed. And before we get to the message, I would like to read this card. Very thoughtful, and I really appreciate it. Put it right side up. It says, Pastor, you are an inspiration because of your life is a reflection of the one you serve. This service you do not only helps the needs of God's people, it also brings many more thanks to God. Quote from 2 Corinthians 9. Thank you, and the Lord bless you, and for giving of yourself to make an eternal difference in the lives of others. From the congregation of Egypt Community Church. As those who served on the search committee there 5.5 years ago, actually, we all knew as soon as we were all in that room together, excuse me, as soon as we were all in that room together, we knew this was God's will. We just knew. I called my wife when I got back in my vehicle from that initial interview, if you will. And I told Martha, if you remember, I've never been in an interview like this before, where we just knew where this was headed. My one regret is that Dad knew that I was applying here, but the Lord called him home before that following April when I came to serve. But he knew I was being looked at up here. And I'm sure the Lord has filled him in by now. And you, those of you who've lost loved ones can identify with that, certainly. And I'll never forget, Dad was pretty much a man of the world. He never really was the spiritual leader of our home. He was a believer, but never the spiritual leader in the home. And when the day came that I broke the news that I really felt God was calling me to preach the gospel and to go in the ministry, and I was just waiting. What's he going to say? He said, well, Brad, if that's what you intend to do, you be the best pastor you can be. And I've been doing my level best to do that. With plenty of failures along the way, and shortcomings, and just downright sin here and there. It's been an interesting journey. So has this journey through the period of the Judges. And I think that as each of us looks at what these folks went through, I think all of us can identify with this concept of failure. Not the least of which, Shimshon. Remember? Sunshine? Samson. And we considered the thought, well, what if? Just what if Samson hadn't been subject or allowed himself to be subject to his passions, his physical drives? Just imagine what he could accomplish. And the signal that God gave us with that was that he accomplished more in his death than his entire 20-year career. Wow. Just think. But you know, what ifs? You can waste a lot of time considering the what ifs, and we need to focus on the what is. The final judge, at least in what we call the period of the judges, Eli and Samuel were considered judges, so to speak. But when we think of the period of the judges, this is what we think of, and Shimshon being the last one of them. And he was now dead. After a less than stellar career, we might add. And now, as we read the final chapters of the period of the judges, we realize that these were indeed very dark days. And you might think this is a little aggressive, tackling 5 chapters here in one session. But as I prepared this message, it became abundantly clear to me that I did not want to spend 5 weeks or even 3 weeks on these last 5 chapters, because they all blend into one situation, and that is dark days. And some of this is hard to read. I don't know if any of you read these chapters in anticipation of today's message. I know Jeff did, and he knew exactly what I meant when he said, I got to be ready with this mic. And I said, this is not a shouting message. This is a dark message. He said, I understand, as he read it. Most of what we're going to do today is read what it says here. It's really a struggle. And as I said, as I studied this, heaviness came over me. Not just because of this that happened over 3,000 years ago, but because of the days in which we live are dark days. Please open your Bibles, turn to Judges and chapter 17. Now there was a man from the mountains of Ephraim whose name was Micah. And now what you need to understand about Micah, now there is a prophet that we refer to as Micah, but Micah is actually a shortened version. You know how we say Brad for Bradley or Joe for Joseph and so on, Rosie for Rosemary, shortened versions. Micah is actually a shortened version of Mikayehu, which means who is like Yahweh. You know, the high name of God, the name God gave himself. I am that I am, the self-existent name of God. It truly describes who he is. It's not a name per se, it's a description. He is who he is. I am who I am. And that's when he said to Mo, tell him I am sent you. What do you mean, what's my name? If we were standing before him, we wouldn't have to ask his name in his kingdom. But Mo was still in his physical body. So, Mikayehu in the mountains of Ephraim. Verse 2. And he said to his mother, the 1,100 shekels of silver that were taken from you, on which you put a curse, even saying it in my ears, here is the silver with me. I took it. And his mother said, may you be blessed of the Lord, my son. It's kind of like the story of George Washington and the cherry tree, you know, which reminds me of a story my dad used to tell about a kid worked on a farm, and it was his father's farm, and he and his brothers got together and said, man, this would be a lot of fun, just push that outhouse right into the river. And they did. And sometime later, here came their father soaking wet. And he started to wail on them. They said, Dad, what about George Washington? He chopped down the cherry tree and his father didn't punish him because he told the truth. And he said, George Washington's father wasn't in the cherry tree when he chopped it down. But his mother says, may you be blessed of the Lord, my son. And before you think she's a little cracked, he had returned the 1,100 shekels to her. Now, 1,100 shekels of silver, remember, that was the price that Delilah received from each of the lords of the Philistines for prying out of Samson the secret of his strength. That's a fair amount of money. And she's glad it was found. And so when he returned it to her, the 1,100 shekels of silver to her, his mother said, I had wholly dedicated the silver from my hand to the Lord for my son to make a carved image and a molded image. Now, therefore, I will return it to you. And thus he returned the silver to his mother. And then his mother took 200 shekels of the silver and gave them to a silversmith, and he made it into a carved image, a molded image. And they were in the house of Micah. And the man Micah had a shrine, and he made an ephod, ephod, sound familiar? An ephod and household idols. He consecrated one of his sons, who became his priest. And verse 6 kind of summarizes this whole section of the book. She gave it back to him to make gods for their home. And here comes this wandering Levite. Verse 6, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did whatever they wanted. Now there was a young man from Bethlehem in Judah, of the family of Judah. He was a Levite and was staying there. The man departed from the city of Bethlehem in Judah to stay wherever he could find a place. And he came to the mountains of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, as he had journeyed. And Micah said to him, where do you come from? And he said, I am a Levite from Bethlehem in Judah. I'm on my way to find a place to stay. Hint, hint. And Micah said to him, well, dwell with me and be a father and a priest to me, and I will give you 10 shekels of silver a year, a suit of clothes, and your sustenance. So the Levi went in. Sounded like a good gig to him. All he has to do is be this guy's priest. Then the Levite was content to dwell with the man, and the young man became like one of his sons to him. So Micah consecrated the Levite, and the young man became his priest, and lived in the house of Micah. And he said, now I know that the Lord will be good to me, since I have a Levite as a priest. Boy, that was status. He had his very own priest. In order to conduct services with the idols he had made. The Tephilim, the idols. Now, you might want to say, well, chapter 17 is kind of a downer, Brad. Can we just stop there? No. It gets better, meaning it gets worse. Chapter 18. Before we flip the screen, no king in Israel in those days. So you know that this was written in retrospect. And everyone did whatever they wanted. Does that ring a bell? Does that ring a bell? Chapter 18. In those days there was no king in Israel. Do you think the author is trying to make a point to us? It's not the last time it's going to be mentioned. And as a matter of fact, this chapter starts out with it. In those days, there was no king in Israel. And in those days, the tribe of the Danites was seeking an inheritance for itself to dwell in. For until that day, their inheritance among the tribes of Israel had not fallen to them. Well, not really. They did have a place that they were living. So the children of Dan sent 5 men of their family from their territory. See, they had territory. They just didn't like it. Men of valor from Zorah and Eshtaol to spy out the land and search it, they said. Go search the land. So they went to the mountains of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, and they lodged there. And while they were at the house of Micaiah, they recognized the voice of the young Levite. They knew this guy. They turned aside and said to him, "Who brought you here? What are you doing in this place? What do you have here?" In other words, what keeps you here? He said to them in verse 4, "Thus and so Micah did for me." So they even said this and that back then. Yada, yada, yada. He did this and that. He has hired me and I have become his priest. Ain't that some stuff? They said to him, "Please inquire of God that we may know whether the journey on which we go will be prosperous." They already said what they wanted to hear, okay? And the priest said to them, "Go in peace. The presence of the Lord be with you on your way." And that's easy to say, shalom aleichem. The peace of God be over you. Verse 7. So the 5 men departed and went to Laish. Now, you see down there on the left, that dark green area, that's where Dan lived, the tribe of Dan. And they were headed up here to the town of Laish, way up here in the territory of Naphtali. So the 5 men departed, went to Laish. They saw the people who were there, how they dwelt safely in the manner of the Sidonians, quiet and secure. There were no rulers in the land who might put them to shame for anything. They were far from the Sidonians, whose wing they were basically under, and they had no ties with anyone. Verse 8, the spies came back to their brethren at Zorah and Eshtaol, and their brethren said to them, "What is your report?" And they said, "Arise, let us go up against them, for we have seen the land. Indeed, it is very good. Would you do nothing? Do not hesitate to go and enter to possess the land." Kind of has another ring to it. There are a number of things about this whole passage that has rings to it. Verse 10. When you go, you will come to a secure people and a large land, for God has given it into your hands, a place where there is no lack of anything that is on the earth. Verse 11, and 600 men of the family of the Danites went from there, from Zorah and Eshtaol, armed with weapons of war. And then they went up and encamped at Kiriath Jearim in Judah. And that's just over on the other side of the border between Benjamin and Judah, the northern border. And they passed from there to the mountains of Ephraim and came to the house of Micah. See the light green section right there, almost in the middle of the screen. That is the territory of Ephraim. Then the 5 men who had gone to spy out the country of Laish answered and said to their brethren, "Do you know that there are in these houses an ephod, a household idols, carved image, a molten image? Now therefore consider what you should do." So they turned aside, came to the house of the young Levite, to the house of Micah, and greeted him. 600 men armed for war, who were of the children of Dan, stood by the entrance of the gate. Verse 17. Then the 5 men who had gone to spy out the land went up. Entering there, they took the carved image, the ephod, the household idols, and the molded image. The priest stood at the entrance of the gate with the 600 men who were armed with weapons of war. When these went into Micah's house and took the carved image, the ephod, the household idols, and the molded image, the priest said to them, "Yo, what do you think you're doing?" And they said to him, "Be quiet. Put your hand over your mouth." No, but shut up. "Come with us. Be a father and a priest to us. Is it not better for you to be a priest to the household of one man, or that you be a priest to the tribe and a family in Israel?" Sounded good to him. He was offered a better gig. So the priest's heart was glad. All right, I've hit the jackpot now. And he took the ephod and the household idols and the carved image and took his place among those people. And then they turned and departed, put the little ones, the livestock, and the goods in front of them. And when they were a good way from the house of Micah, the men who were in the houses near Micah's house gathered together and overtook the children of Dan. They called out to the children of Dan. So they turned around and said to Micah, "What ails you? What's your problem that you have gathered such a company?" He said, "You have taken away my gods." And the word there is not the lethalim for idols that was used before. This is the word Elohim. Now you might remember in Genesis, Elohim is the very first name for God used, and it is a plural name of God. As a matter of fact, the exact same word is used like this, and it is used here, as a plural for lowercase g, gods, plural. You have taken away my gods, which I made, and the priest, and you have gone away. Now what more do I have? How can you say to me, what's your problem? What ails you? Verse 25. And the children of Dan said to him, "Do not let your voice be heard among us, lest angry men fall upon you, and you lose your life with the lives of your household." In other words, there's 600 of us, and there's 20 or 30 of you. Do you want to make something of it? Then the children of Dan went on their way, because the answer was obvious. Micah saw they were too strong for him. He turned and went back to his house, and he didn't bother them anymore. So they took the things Micah had made and the priest who had belonged to him and went to Laish. Isn't that interesting, the way that's expressed? The priest that had belonged to him. The priest belonged in the service of the Lord at the tabernacle and later in the temple. But belonged to him? That's because he was paying him a salary. He was not giving his tithe to the work of the Lord, and that's what paid the priest. The priest was in his employ. They went to Laish, to a quiet people, quiet and secure, and they struck them with the edge of the sword and burned the city with fire. There was no deliverer, because it was far from Sidon. They had no ties with anyone. They didn't have anybody that they could get on the phone and say, "Yo, we're having a problem. Can you come over and help?" It was in the valley that belongs to Beth Rehob. And so they rebuilt the city and dwelled there. See it up there? They went a fair piece away from where they were. And they called the name of the city Dan, as opposed to Laish, which it was called before, after the name of Dan, their father, who was born to Israel. That's the man Israel, or Jacob. However, the name of the city formerly was Laish. So the writer's making sure you understand what city they're talking about. Verse 30. And the children of Dan set up for themselves the carved image. And Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, and his sons were the priests to the tribe of Dan until the day of the captivity of the land. And so here we find out the priest's name, Jonathan. So they set up for themselves Micaiah's carved image, which he made, all the time that the house of God was in Shiloh. So they were doing their own thing while the official house of God was in Shiloh. And you know, that looks like a long way, but Israel's not a big place. Okay? It's about the size of New Jersey, approximately. They were doing their own thing. Remember, in those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did that which was right in his own eyes. In other words, they did whatever they wanted to. There it is right there. Shiloh. Chapter 19. I really think we should be getting the message by now. Again, no king in Israel. There was no king in Israel. That there was a certain Levite staying in the remote mountains of Ephraim. Same guy. He took for himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. But his concubine played the harlot against him and went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah and was there 4 whole months. Her husband arose and went after her to speak kindly to her and to bring her back, having his servant and a couple of donkeys with him. And so she brought him into her father's house. And the father of the young woman saw him. He was glad to meet him. Now his father-in-law, the young woman's father, detained him, and he stayed with him 3 days. So they ate and drank and lodged there. Then it came to pass on the 4th day that they rose early in the morning for him to depart. But the young woman's father said to his son-in-law, "Look, refresh yourself with a morsel of bread. Eat first and then go." Okay, so they sat down, verse 6, and the two of them ate and drank together. And then the young woman's father said to the man, "Look, be content to stay all night. Let your heart be merry. Stick around, have a good time, relax. Take a load off." Verse 7, and when the man stood to depart, his father-in-law urged him, so he lodged there again. And then he arose early in the morning on the 5th day to depart. But the young woman's father said, "Please refresh your heart." And so they stayed till the afternoon, and both of them ate. And when the man stood to depart, verse 9, he and his concubine and his servant, his father-in-law, the young woman's father, said to him, "Look, the day is now drawing toward the evening. Please spend the night." I think this guy was really lonely. Didn't get much company. "Seeing the day is coming to an end there, that your heart may be merry. Tomorrow go your way early so that you may get home. However, the man was not willing to spend that night. He'd been there almost a week. So he rose and departed and came opposite of Jebus, which is what Jerusalem previously was called. Remember, the Jebusites established the original town of Jerusalem that the Israelites overtook. With him were the 2 saddled donkeys. His concubine was also with him. Verse 11, they were near Jebus, and the day was far spent. The servant said to his master, "Come, please, let us turn aside into this city of the Jebusites and lodge in it." But his master said to him, verse 12, "We will not turn aside here into a city of foreigners who are not of the children of Israel." Jebusites were not Israelites. "We will go on to Gibeah," which was an Israelite town. Gibeah was in the territory of Benjamin. "Come, let us draw to near to one of these places and spend the night in Gibeah or in Ramah." Verse 14, and they passed by and went their way, and the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. And they turned aside there to go in to lodge in Gibeah. And when he went in, he sat down in the open square of the city, for no one would take them into his house to spend the night. Just then, an old man came in from his work in the field at evening, who also was from the mountains of Ephraim. And he was staying in Gibeah, whereas the men of the place were Benjamites. And when he raised his eyes, he saw the traveler in the open square of the city, and the old man said, "Where are you going? Where do you come from?" And the Levite said, "We are passing from Bethlehem in Judah toward the remote mountains of Ephraim. I am from there. I went to Bethlehem in Judah. Now I'm going to the house of the Lord, but there is no one who will take me into his house." Verse 19, "Although we have both straw and fodder for our donkeys, and bread and wine for myself and for your female servant, and for the young man who is with your servant, there is no lack of anything." And the old man said, "Peace be with you, Shalom Aleichem. However, let all your needs be my responsibility. Only do not spend the night in the open square." So he brought him into his house and gave him fodder for the donkeys, and they washed their feet and ate and drank. So let's take a look here. There is approximately where Gibeah is. So we're not talking about great distances here. Verse 22. Ugh. As they were enjoying themselves, suddenly, certain men of the city, perverted men. And the word for perverted there is the word Belial. And it is directly related to the word Belial that we see Paul used in 2 Corinthians 6 when he said, what accord does Christ have with Belial? Same word. And this Belial, and that's actually how you say it in the Hebrew, means worthless or wicked or perverted. Perverted men surrounded the house and beat on the door, and they spoke to the master of the house, the old man, saying, bring out the man who came to your house, that we may know him. Does this have a ring to it? And an easy way to remember it is this. Judges 19 relates to Genesis 19. Wicked, perverted men pounding on the door. Bring out the one that's visiting you so that we may know him. Wene dayenu is the word, and it's a derivative of the word yoda, which means to know sexually. Adam knew his wife, yoda. Same word is used over in Genesis 19. Bring him out so that we may know them. And here they are saying, bring him out so that we may know him. In other words, it was commonplace in that town. Does that ring a bell? We are surrounded by wickedness, brothers and sisters. Surrounded by wickedness. When Lot found himself in that situation, God told him, get out. Don't even look back. Too many of us are looking back and allowing the world and its pleasures infect us. You say, this is really bad. It gets worse. And as we move along, you'll understand why my heart became so heavy as I read this. Verse 23, but the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said, no, my brethren, I beg you, do not do this wicked act. Seeing this man has come into my house, do not commit this outrage. Look, here's my virgin daughter and the man's concubine. Let me bring them out. Humble them, do with them as you please, but to this man do not such a vile thing. Does that ring a bell? There was wickedness in the land of Israel. Verse 26. Verse 25. The men would not heed him, so the man took his concubine and brought her out to them, and they knew her, Yodah, and abused her all night until morning. When the day began to break, they let her go. Can you imagine what that woman went through all night? They say human trafficking is a worse problem today than it has ever been. Yeah, we outlawed slavery, but slavery still exists. Women and children, especially. Human trafficking. These were dark days. These are dark days. The woman came as the day was dawning, verse 26, and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was, till it was light. When her master arose in the morning and opened the doors of the house, and went out to go his way, there was his concubine fallen by the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. That's as far as she got. He said to her, "Get up, let us be going." Can you imagine? Not, "Are you okay? What happened to you? Come on, get up, let's get going." He knew very well what she'd been through that night. And I have to add here, after all the strides we've made in our culture for the protection of women and children especially, they want to pass H.R. 5 that lets men who pretend or think they're women go into a locker room or a bathroom or a shower where women are. I told you this is a hard message. That's where we are. So let's not look down our noses at these people in Gibeah. We're far worse today. Far worse. We're making it legal. Trying to. If you haven't called your senators yet, shame on you. I'll just say it right out. If you don't like it, I don't care. Shame on you if you haven't called your senators and told them this bill is despicable. And it sets back decades of protection for women and children. Really? They don't even have to think they're women. They can pretend to think they're women. This is a sexual pervert's dream come true if they pass that bill. Call your senators and tell them what you think. Get up, let's be going. What a callous thing to say. No surprise, there was no answer. So the man lifted her up onto the donkey, probably just laying over face down. The man got up and went to his place. Verse 29, they entered his house. Remember I said it gets worse? This story was bad enough already. He took a knife, laid hold of his concubine. How do you read this? And divided her into 12 pieces, limb by limb, and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. How do we read that and not be affected? Why do we not have any shame anymore? Because sin has blinded our eyes. That's why. And people who serve the one true living God need to have the courage to say, this is sin. And God, not us, God will punish it. Brothers and sisters, when we see Revelation 20 happen before our very eyes, we will declare and know that God is just in his judgment of sin. Just. This is wickedness. He didn't send a message throughout all Israel. He sent her body in pieces throughout Israel. Limb by limb. Sent her throughout all the territory. Notice one piece for each tribe. How do you think it would go over if our town received a head or a hand or a foot or a leg or an arm or a torso as a message? You'd say, that's pretty sick. And you would be right. You see, There was no king in Israel in those days, and everyone did whatever they felt like. And so it was that all who saw it said, no such deed has been done or seen from the day that the children of Israel came up from the land until now. Consider it, confer, and speak up. It was unheard of even in those dark, despicable days. Unheard of. Verse 20. So all the children of Israel came out from Dan to Beersheba, as well as from the land of Gilead, and the congregation gathered together as one man before the Lord at Mizpah. And the leaders of all the people and all the tribes of Israel presented themselves in the assembly of the people of God, 400,000 foot soldiers who drew the sword. Armed men from all over Israel. Then the children of Israel said, tell us, how did this wicked deed happen? So the Levite and the husband of the woman who was murdered answered and said, my concubine and I went to Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin, to spend the night. The men of Gibeah rose against me, surrounded the house at night because of me. They intended to kill me, but instead they ravished my concubine so that she died. I took hold of my concubine, cut her into pieces, and sent her throughout the territory of the inheritance of Israel, because they committed lewdness and outrage in Israel. Look, all of you are children of Israel. Give your advice and counsel here. Now, verse 8, so all the people arose as one man, said, not one of us will go back to his tent, nor will any turn back to his house. But now, this is the thing which we will do to Gibeah. We will go up against it by lot. Verse 10, we will take 10 men out of every 100 throughout all the tribes of Israel, 100 out of every 1,000, and 1,000 out of every 10,000, to make provisions for the people, that when they come to Gibeah in Benjamin, they may repay all the vileness that they have done in Israel. So all the men of Israel were gathered against the city, united as one man. And the tribes of Israel sent men throughout all the tribe of Benjamin, saying, what is this wickedness that you have done among you? Now therefore deliver up the men, the perverted men who are in Gibeah, that we may put them to death and remove the evil from Israel. But the children of Benjamin would not listen to the voice of the brethren, the children of Israel. Instead, the children of Benjamin gathered themselves together from their cities to Gibeah to go to battle against the children of Israel. And I'm going to summarize this for you. 400,000 men of Israel. They came against Benjamin's 26,000. You'd say, duck soup, right? Done deal. Not so much. The first day, Benjamin killed 22,000 Israelites. Wow. They're outnumbered several times to one. Day 2, 18,000. That's 40,000 casualties. I wasn't a math major, but I can add 22 and 18. 40,000 casualties. Day 3, Israel inquired of the Lord, said, whoa, what's going on? And so they set an ambush. And then it so happened that 25,000 men of Benjamin fell. They surrounded the Benjamites, chased them, and easily trampled them down as far as the front of Gibeah toward the east. 18,000 men of Benjamin fell. These were men of valor. And then they turned and fled toward the wilderness of the rock. They cut down 5,000 of them there. I'm in verse 45. Then they pursued them relentlessly up to Gibeon and killed 2,000 of them. So all who fell of Benjamin that day were 25,000 men who drew the sword. They started out with 26,000. You think they took a hit? I think they took a hit. Kind of reminds me of the Battle of Gettysburg, the bloodiest battle in U.S. military history. Over 50,000 men from both sides fell. The Union won the battle. It was a 3-day battle. This was a 3-day battle. In that 3-day battle, even though the Union won the battle, they lost 23,000 men. Confederates lost upwards of 28,000, which is over 50,000 soldiers. The number is not quite certain about the Confederate loss. 3 days, over 50,000. Do you realize what the losses are here? Israel won the battle, but they lost 40,000 people. 10% of their fighting force. Wow. You don't even have to figure what the percentage is for the Benjamites. They lost 25,000 of their 26,000. Wow. This 3-day battle compiled 65,000 casualties, considerably worse than our Gettysburg tally. You say, okay, Brad, how can it get any worse? Chapter 21. Now the men of Israel had sworn an oath at Mizpah, saying, none of us shall give his daughter to Benjamin as a wife. And the people came to the house of God and remained there before God until evening. They lifted up their voices and wept bitterly and said, O Lord God of Israel, why has this come to pass in Israel, that today there should be one tribe missing in Israel? Why should this come to pass? They just did it. They annihilated Benjamin, essentially. So it was on the next morning that the people rose early and built an altar and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. And the children of Israel said, who is there among all the tribes of Israel who did not come up with the assembly to the Lord? For they had made an oath concerning anyone who had not come up to the Lord at Mizpah. Surely he shall be put to death. And the children of Israel grieved for Benjamin, their brother. One tribe is cut off from Israel today. You know, a lot of parallels to our own experience in America. The Civil War was incredibly costly. Incredibly costly. Father against son, brother against brother. That's exactly what we have here. And the tally was worse. And they didn't have bombs or cannons. They just had swords, spears, and bows. Verse 7, what shall we do for wives for those who remain? Remember, there were 600 who survived of Benjamin out of 26,000. What one is there from the tribes of Israel who did not come to Mizpah to the Lord? And in fact, no one had come to the camp from Jabesh Gilead to the assembly. For when the people counted, indeed, not one of the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead was there. They slaughtered Jabesh Gilead for not joining in the oath. They sent 12,000 of their most valiant men, and they struck Jabesh Gilead with the edge of the sword, including women and children. Including women and children. Kind of rings of our history as we went through the Midwest and the West, killing the red man and his women and his children. Solomon was right when he said there's nothing new under the sun. Nothing. Sin is just as despicable as it ever was. They destroyed every male, every woman who had known a man. And they took 400 young virgins who had not known a man intimately, and they brought them to the camp at Shiloh, to the land of Canaan. So to bring you up to date, that's where the battle, that's Jabesh Gilead up there in Manasseh. They didn't come to the meeting, and so their whole town got slaughtered except for 400 virgins. And they took those 400 virgins from Jabesh Gilead, Israelites, to give as wives to the 600 Benjamites that survived. You say, well, that doesn't add up. You're right. There's more. What shall we do for the wives of those who remain? And the short version of the story is they let them go out and capture young virgins who went out in the vineyards singing their songs and dancing their dances, and kidnapped them. To make up the difference of the 600, remember they kept 400 virgins from Jabesh Gilead, and now they let them make up the difference with the young women that went out to dance. As wives for the survivors of the tribe that they had annihilated. You see what I mean? This is hard to read. It's hard to fathom. Try fathoming how many babies we slaughter in mothers' wombs today and cut them in pieces and sell the pieces for profit. They got nothing on us. Millions. Those were indeed dark days. And as this section began, so it ends, verse 25. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did whatever they wanted. Idolatry, adultery, perversion, murder, civil war, violence against women. Sounds like a page from today's news, does it not? We're there, brothers and sisters. We're there. Why did God preserve this story for us? So we would recognize when we're doing the very same thing as a people. God, help us. What's interesting is, not long after the troubled period of the judges, God would send a prophet and a king to bring order to the kingdom. Maybe this was a prophetic news story after all. Even so, come, Lord Jesus. Lord, help us not to lament those things that were done then as much as we lament what is going on today. Give us courage to take a stand, Lord, for you and your kingdom and for righteousness and against wickedness. Some of us may die, Lord, so be it. Help us to be faithful, for we would rather live in fear of your righteous judgment than of anything that man can do to us. Drive it home to our hearts, Lord, to serve you no matter what in these, our dark days. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. Let's stand together. Worship team.